There's a genre in literature and art referred to as satire. Not everyone is comfortable with it. Satire intentionally targets individuals or institutions or groups within a society, targets them with humor and irony to critically expose their stupidity or vice. Often those who are targeted fail to appreciate the humor, let alone concede their own stupidity. But satire, when done well, offers a tremendous relief to those who are otherwise without means to describe all that so blatantly feels ridiculous on the world stage. So satire provides a kind of catharsis for society, a chance to let loose with laughter, though usually at someone else's expense. We in Salt Lake City are especially fortunate in having a good satirist of our very own. Pat Bagley's cartoons, regularly featured in the Salt Lake Tribune, raise the ire of some, but provides for many of us a refreshing and honest look at how ludicrous our laws, our traditions, our leaders, our prejudices. If satire has an objective, it might be summed up as aspiring to get individuals or institutions to recognize their flawed behavior enough to embarrass them and to hopefully change and improve their ways. Now, cartoons represent one form of satire. There are many others. The Capitol Steps, for example, through clever songs, make light of politicians who take themselves far too seriously. Their pomposity and poorly designed policies get shot down with humor, underscoring that which we have suspected all along, namely those folks in Washington make no sense. Garrison Keillor's satirical style, kind of a bedrock stand-up comedy thing, often aimed at Unitarians, makes me laugh and say ouch at the same time. But I believe that all of us here would defend to the death the right of Keillor, the Capitol Steps, Pat Bagley, to be free in their practice of satire. Freedom of speech remains the foundation of democracy. The free expression of ideas comprises the sacred component of society. The justification for war, we claim, sending our troops into harm's way in very distant places for the sake of keeping America free. France also relishes its tradition of freedom. Liberty holds top billing in what they value as a society. And as Adam Gopnik in the New Yorker reminded us a few weeks ago, France's satiric tradition of outrageous caricatures extends back historically to at least 1831, when Daumier drew a cartoon of the head of King Louis Philippe shaped like a pear. And he was brought to trial for that indiscretion. And so I kind of like to think of satire as that which turns indiscretion into an art form. It offers commentary with a piercing edge. Its insightful and creative humor helps us deal with so many things. Life's unfairness, its banalities, its ironies, as well as exposing some people for being disingenuous. Now, as in most art forms, satire can also miss the mark. Art is not always perfect. We know bad music, bad poetry, and satire can sometimes be bad as well. And that can happen easily enough when satire crosses a fine line into ridicule and blasphemy. The results of bad satire can be quite problematic and come with unexpected consequences. The very first example of satire recorded in the civilized world suffered its own share of complications. Plato accused the satirist Aristophanes of slander when his play The Clouds was performed in the year 423 before the Common Era. Plato contended that the play contributed to the trial of Socrates, and then by extension, the verdict that condemned him to death. Socrates in that play was ridiculed, lampooned as head of a school named the Thinkery, in which he taught mostly young people that the gods were not responsible for everything like they had been taught. Instead, Socrates filled their young minds with notions about the evolution of ideas and intellect. Rather than the gods, it was human advancement in learning that accounted for the high level of where society found itself back in those times. But Socrates was framed in this as a buffoon and not to be taken seriously, quite dangerous, possibly. Lampoon falls into the category of virulent satire, expressly nasty and bitter, with a clear intent to ridicule rather than criticize with a humorous protective cushion. Plato correctly observed the fine line between lampooning and slandering. They're almost indistinguishable. And it kind of begs the question, to what extent does one have the freedom to express derogatory remarks? To what extent do we have the freedom to even express hate-filled speech? Do we embrace freedom of speech as an absolute, with no limits at all placed on free expression? Or do we try to draw lines of what is not acceptable under free speech, and heaven help those who think they know where the lines ought to be drawn? In 1977, the ACLU defended the right of the American Nazi Party to march in Skokie, a Jewish suburb of Chicago. And the U.S. Supreme Court took the case up the very next year and ruled that the First Amendment protects individual rights to express their views, even if most people consider those views extremely offensive. How far can this basic, all-encompassing freedom of speech, protected by the First Amendment, how far can this be stretched even in a democracy? After the brutal massacre of the dozen staff members at Charlie Hebdo by Islamic fundamentalists, Richard Malka, the staff lawyer for the weekly satirical magazine, he went on the air in France, and this is what he said, and I quote exactly. "We will not give in. The spirit of Je suis Charlie means the right to blaspheme." Well, aside from personally not agreeing with his interpretation of Je suis Charlie, we need to ask, quite frankly, should blasphemy be protected under the umbrella of free speech? Now remember, the French tradition holds that nothing is sacred. But blasphemy can skid easily into provocative hate speech. Does contempt for another tradition and the mockery of their culture's sense of sacred deserve the right to be protected as an unconditional license to free expression? Ayaan Hirsi Ali, the Somalian-born American woman activist and powerful advocate of women's rights, giving, whenever she can, incendiary speeches about Islam and their treatment of women, has an extremely hard time finding a podium in any of our nation's universities. So we need to wonder then if, after all, certain lines aren't in fact drawn even in a democracy. She was given a free speech award some years back by a Danish newspaper, yet her voice is mostly repressed in our country. She loudly defends the right to offend. She says, I have the right to offend. As an American, I have the right to offend. This kind of makes me laugh a little, because one often hears that Unitarian ministers are only doing their job when they offend people in church. It comes under the heading of a free pulpit. The caveat to that, however, is the other side of the equation, a congregation's right to criticize. Now, you will be pleased to know that the members of this church frequently exercises that right. So we say we're all doing our jobs. Was the staff at Charlie Hebdo really doing their job? Were they writing satire? Or had they somehow skidded off the tracks? The cartoonist, Renaud Douzier, who drew the actual depiction of the prophet that incited the insane shooting spree in Paris, survived the massacre because he was late for work that morning. He had inadvertently overslept. These were his comments following the deaths of his co-workers. And again, I quote exactly. We have confidence in people's intelligence, and we have confidence in humor. The people who did this attack have no sense of humor. In turn, I want to bring his intelligence into question and wonder about what he claims is funny. I mean, I personally would loathe to trust the humor of any religious fundamentalist. I would comment to that cartoonist that I too have confidence in people's intelligence and expect that even a purported satirical magazine would understand that most Muslims, not a fanatical few, most Muslims consider any depiction of their prophet as blasphemous. Why push the envelope? I guess the right exists to blaspheme, but consequences will surely follow when something so sacred is ridiculed. Although, again, the French position is nothing is sacred, intelligence would hopefully prevail in order to avoid tragic circumstances. In 1987, the American artist Andre Serrano plunged a plastic crucifix into a glass of his own urine and photographed it under the title, Piss Christ. He said he was making a statement on the misuse of religion. Our U.S. Senate thought it was time to stop public art funding. It's ironic, though, that when that photo went on a touring exhibit, it was in Avignon, France, that it was destroyed by Catholic fundamentalists wielding hammers. American and French traditions of free speech need to be re-examined for their hypocrisy. After 17 million French people rallied at the Place de la République with raised pencils in their fists, crying out for freedom of the press, the next day, French officials arrested 54 people for hate speech, including a well-known controversial comedian. It appears French officials may lack a sense of humor themselves. The arrests have raised questions about double standards for free speech. Now, there seems to be one set of rules for cartoonists who freely blaspheme religions of all kinds, even when Muslims and Catholics object. And another set of rules for the Muslim supporters of the gunmen, which have led to their persecution and sentencing them to hard labor. So free speech, it seems, must be withheld only from terrorists, and as long as the terrorists can easily be profiled by their dress and skin color, officials will crack down on free expression among Muslims. Following the murders at Charlie Hebdo, 12 interior ministers for the EU, including France, Germany, Great Britain, called on internet providers to identify and take down online content that, quote, aims to incite hatred and terror. So a line has been drawn in the sand concerning free speech. Hateful cartoons are protected, and hateful speech by Muslims is cause for incarceration. It must be that the terrorists attack what we hold sacred, namely life itself. Robin Kohler, an award-winning Chicago-based journalist and syndicated columnist, wrote 2 weeks ago about our complete incongruence when it comes to understanding terrorism. He says, and I quote, "I feel the shock and emotional pull of these murders in Paris as much as anyone else, but I'm unable to understand why they seem to matter more than our bombing and killing of tens of thousands of civilian Syrians, Afghans, Iraqis, which are also acts of terror. Muhammad weeps for them too. So does the inexpressible largeness in everyone's heart. Je suis Charlie. I am every victim of war and terror. In trying to sort out for myself the complexities inherent in free speech, I turn to our Unitarian Universalist principles. Now, surely you will think, well, now it's time for me to raise once again that first principle that we promote the inherent worth and dignity of all people. I think that's great, but I'm really focused on another principle, the sixth principle, which is rarely referred to. And the sixth principle says Unitarian Universalists promote the goal of world community. We promote the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. Now, what are those implications for us? Now, I believe that the world community can withstand and, in fact, be aided by humor, satire, exposing irony. However, as long as we recognize the goal as achieving world community, there must be respect for that which is held sacred. How could we otherwise coexist peacefully? Human intelligence, then, must understand the limits of what may be accomplished by hate speech and the destructive nature of blasphemy. Do we have the right to willfully and maliciously offend other cultures when our faith informs us that it is our duty to promote world community? Community. All human beings are kin. Humankind as a family. Building world community is not just secular or political work. It's profoundly religious. The great Jewish philosopher Martin Buber once addressed a United Nations conference in which he said that at the beginning of the modern world, that is at the time of the American and French revolutions, three ideals were said to walk hand in hand: liberty, equality, and what was then called fraternity. Today we might call the last, more inclusively, the spirit of kinship. Liberty, equality, and the spirit of kinship. Buber went on. Over time, the ideals changed their character, especially in America. Liberty became confused with freedom from any sort of restraint. As individualists, Americans were unfettered by any limitations. They were, in the spirit of individualism, free, totally free to exploit the land and exploit other people. Equality did not extend to Native Americans, African slaves, and women. And I'm sure Buber would not mind my extending that to include the homosexual community. He said that kinship, the sense that we are all brothers and sisters together, we are all children of one great mystery. That's an ideal linked to religious principle. And yet, he says, modern intellectuals and revolutionaries scorn religion. So this ideal took to hiding among communities of the powerless. Buber's remarks remain especially relevant to us today. Can our embrace of free speech without restraint, can our embrace of free speech without restraint really help in efforts to build a world community? And concerning the business of humor, we can all benefit from the insights of a great humorist who does both satire and physical humor, namely John Cleese. His autobiography has just been published, and his humorous jabs at religion, among everything else in life he experienced growing up, they're all rooted in the healthy perspective of being able to laugh at oneself as well as those who are pompous and what he calls neurotic. But he adds, not that laughter can't be unkind and destructive. Like most manifestations of human behavior, it ranges from the loving to the hateful. The latter produces nasty racial jokes and savage teasing. The former, warm and affectionate banter, and the kind of inclusive humor that says, isn't the human condition absurd, but we're all in the same boat. That seems like such an easy prescription. And yet, we all go to such extremes to deny our interconnectedness To deny all that, which simply implies we're all in the same boat, riding the waters of our common home, the earth. As Unitarian Universalists, we affirm and promote the goal of world community with peace, liberty, justice,